Hey everybody, this is Scott again. Thought I would take some time to do another quick Ember tutorial. I know it's been a little while, so I thought I would post one on a pretty general topic, which is creating an Ember add-on. So Ember add-ons are one of the best things, kind of about the whole Ember ecosystem. There's add-ons for lots of different things. You're using them already. If you look at your package JSON, look in your dev dependencies in your app, there's tons of add-ons that are added by default. But then there's lots of different ones for like adding helpers, for working with certain data systems, things for helping write tests. And I can show you how you can extract some of the logic that you might have in your app to an add-on so that it can be reused elsewhere. So a few things to kind of point out. One thing I want to create today is an add-on for adding Wistia videos to your Ember project. So I actually have an add-on already that does this, so I'm going to just recreate a simplified version of it so that we can easily just embed this video with just a simple component. And I also want to point out the website Ember Observer. So this is just a website that lists different Ember add-ons, and it gives rankings for these. So if you're ever looking for something specifically, just search for it, see if there's already an add-on that exists. Hopefully that fits your needs, and if not, you can always look at the repo, maybe open a pull request for that. But an important thing to remember when you look at these scores is it's not necessarily based on the quality of the code. It's based on things like how many contributors there are, has there been an update in the last 3 months, are there tests, and do these tests pass? 1 point for having a GitHub star count in the top 10% of all add-ons. So you essentially have to have a really popular add-on to get a perfect score of 10. So it's not necessarily that the add-on is written really well. It's just that it's really popular and that it's maintained. As well as some other things that I'll point out as we go through and create this. Lastly, if you want to see an example of this add-on working in production, you can go to societyofgrownups.com/online classes, and their online classes are hosted via Wistia, and we do some interesting things, or we did some interesting things like pausing the videos at certain points so that people could fill out the learning material. It's one of the cool things about Wistia's JavaScript API. You can do lots of different binding events on the videos themselves. So let's just go to our terminal, and we're going to create a new add-on. So Ember Addon, we'll call it Ember Wistia Video. Oh, and I got access denied. Sudo Ember Addon, Ember Wistia Video, but she's going to tell me that that directory already exists. Yeah. Okay. So this might take a couple minutes. Cool. So once that's done, we can go into our directory here. And let me open this up in my editor. So here's our project, Ember Wistia Video. So it looks a lot like a normal Ember project. But the first thing you'll notice is that you have this add-on directory, as well as the app directory, which is what you would see in a normal Ember app. The add-on directory is where all of our logic is going to live. In the app directory exports the stuff defined in our add-on directory. And the reason for that is when you use an add-on, it consumes everything in the app directory as if it were part of the parent application. So if you add something like a model or a component, the Ember app that uses your add-on is going to treat that like it's part of its application versus extending a component that comes from an add-on. So you typically want to define things in the add-on directory, and if you use Ember-CLI to generate your templates, etc., it's going to do that for you, so you shouldn't really have to worry about it. The next thing I want to point out is our package JSON. So when you go to publish this on NPM, this is going to be the name of your NPM package, as well as the version here. So if you've never published something to NPM, maybe start out with a version 01 or a beta version, really whatever you want to call it. And the description here, the default blueprint for Ember-CLI add-ons, you do want to update if you care about that Ember Observer score. So this is one of the things you'll get docked a point for. So description, component for using Wistia videos, And same with keywords. You can add keywords like video or Wistia. That just kind of helps get your app discovered. Same with author. This is one of those things that you'll get docked points on Ember Observer if you don't have an author. And repository, you would point usually to like your GitHub repository, Bitbucket, wherever you have this living. The next thing I wanted to point out is some of our dev dependencies that are added by default. If you've generated an Ember app in the past year or so, you know that Ember welcome page is something that's added by default. It just kind of gives you a nice template for when you first run your app. We won't need that, so let's just go ahead and delete it. And the next thing that a lot of Ember apps don't use, but it gets added to the dependencies, is Ember Data. So we, in this specifically, will not be using Ember Data. We're not going to create any adapters, serializers, models, anything like that. So we don't need it for our use case. Your add-on might, so it's kind of up to you whether you need this, but here we'll just go ahead and delete that and kind of reduce the size here. Oh, and I seem to still be running into permissions. And what's the command? Who am I? And then everything in here. Okay. I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but it worked. Not sure why I'm running into a permissions issue, but if you do, go ahead and do that. So that just sets the permissions to whoever you're currently logged into. So the next thing that I want to point out is the dependencies versus dev dependencies. One of the things, since we are creating templates in our add-on, we actually need this Ember-CLI HTML bars to be in our dependencies and not our dev dependencies, because the consuming app will rely on this application using a certain version of HTML bars. So we're going to move that to our dependencies, and that really should be all that we need to do in this package JSON. So again, think about things that you may or may not need. I actually don't think we need Ember Ajax either. These are things that are added by default, but our add-on specifically doesn't need that. Cool. So let's do a quick npm install and then a bower install. So if you follow the Wistia JavaScript API documentation, some of this will be pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go into too much depth as what Wistia expects. This isn't really a Wistia tutorial, and we're going to just do a really, really simple example here. But if you're really interested in Wistia, there's lots of really cool things you can do. Their API documentation is actually pretty good, so I would recommend reading through that. So what we want to create now is a component for our actual Wistia video. So Ember generate component. We'll call it Wistia video. And like I said before, you'll see that we get stuff added to our add-on directory as well as our app directory. So let's actually look at what that did. So again, all of our logic's going to live in our add-on directory, and the app directory is just going to export that out so that our parent app can consume that. And if we make changes to it, we're not actually going to be changing this. We're not going to be changing every instance of this component. We're just going to be changing what was essentially an instance of it that was exported. And because of that, the component actually exports the layout as well. So that's what you see here. And that's why we don't see a template in our app directory, because this component.js file exports everything, including the handlebars template, which it calls layout. So yeah, we don't really want to change anything here because we do want the layout exported. If your component doesn't have a template, you can go ahead and delete that. So it might not be fit every use case. And the next thing we want to create is a service. Ember generate service, Wistia, and that's the thing that we will ultimately use to make calls to the Wistia API. So the template, or excuse me, the component is what actually shows the video, and our Wistia service is what communicates to the Wistia JavaScript API. Okay, so we have our service and we have our component, but how do we actually talk to the Wistia API? If you look at their documentation, they just tell you to, throw a script in your application. Okay, so where do we actually throw that so that any parent application that uses our add-on gets access to this? And we put that in the index.js file. So to kind of cover this, where does this stuff actually get consumed? Let me hop into another app real quick. So let's look at the Super Rentals application. And this is the application you would build if you followed the Ember tutorials on the Ember Guides website. And you've seen this in your applications as well, and it's the index.html file. And most likely you haven't really probably edited this except for maybe updating the title. But you might have noticed these hooks: content for head, content for head footer, body footer. And you can actually manipulate these in your application itself. These are reserved for Ember add-ons. Specifically, they're reserved for putting things into the head content or the head footer, like script tags. So yeah, these are specifically for Ember add-ons. Now, that being said, if you're in an application and you want to add something to this content for, but you don't want to create a whole new add-on to extract out because it makes no sense. There aren't a lot of use cases for it. You can create what's called an in-repo add-on, and just show you an example of that. If I go to the Super Rentals, why did that get so big? You can do Ember generate in repo add-on thingy-mabob, and that will actually add that index.js file, and you can just go ahead and make that same change there. So this is, again, for instances where I want to add something to that content for hook. I want to put a script in, but I don't want to go and create a whole add-on that I'm going to have to install. But here, it's really specific to this app, so you can create an in-repo add-on for that. So just one of those things to keep in mind. It might actually work for your specific use case. So the index.js file right now just exports the name by default. So what we want to edit is that content for hook, and that's actually a function. Content for is a function, and it takes a few parameters. The first being type, which is body or head footer, and the next is config, which is our environment config. Now, by default, if we actually just paste this from the documentation, this is what it looks like. So if to type is head, return this, etc., just return an empty string. So we want to add our script tag to the body footer. So we will actually return, and I'm just going to copy and paste this, the script source for Wistia, their JS file. So really, really simple. That's really all we need to do to get that API communicating with our app via our add-on. However, there is an instance where I might not actually want to load this script, and that's in our testing environment. So when I'm running acceptance tests or integration tests, even in my consuming application, I don't want to make requests out to this API. It's a lot of overhead for testing, and we don't really want to write tests to make sure that the video renders or plays, because then we're kind of testing Wistia's documentation, or excuse me, Wistia's API, and we're going to assume that they've tested that. So we can say if the config.environment equals test, then we'll return that, else we'll do what we were doing before. So again, this is just to keep us from hitting that API when we're running through tests. Again, might not make sense for your use case, but for this, I think it makes a lot of sense. Cool. So we have that added in. The next thing that we want to do is communicate with the Wistia API. So that script's there, and now how do we actually communicate with that? And we're going to do that again through our service here. And again, if you just read through the Wistia documentation, you'll see a lot of this. But we're going to write it in Ember here. It's pretty straightforward. So we're going to add a video. According to their documentation, they add something to the window namespace called _WQ. And they recommend that you set it to window WQ if it exists, or default to an array. And their API should eventually pick up on that and add the videos for us. So we're going to push a video to this so that it registers to the Wistia video queue. And we need to pass it what Wistia refers to as a matcher, and it's just this alphanumeric code. It's like the unique identifier for the video. If you go to a particular video, it's in the URL, or if you inspect a video in your browser, you'll see it appended in one of the classes. So again, nothing crazy, it's just how they identify their videos. So window._WQ, and we're going to push that matcher to that queue so that it should render on the page. So we're going to send it a key of matcher, and it expects a callback function where it actually returns the video. So I'm going to use an arrow function here, and this is when we can do lots of crazy stuff, bind events to like playing, pausing, etc. So we're just going to do video bind, and this is a Wistia function. You know, this isn't the JavaScript bind. Play, and maybe we'll just add a console log, you know, video is playing. So that way we can know when our video is added, and that it's when we click it, we should see that console log in there. That's really all we need to do to add the video to the Wistia queue. Once it's added, it's going to look for a div with a specific class name and find that matcher, and that's where it's going to actually load the HTML5 video. So let's go ahead and update our component here so that we can take in the correct parameters. So one of the things that we're going to pass through that obviously is that matcher. I'm going to just define it with a default null. This is just habit I have. I like to pass, or I like to define any keys that this expects as null. It's kind of just documentation, but ultimately it's going to be passed in there. And then we're going to have to call that add video function that we just wrote in our service. We're going to do that in the init hook. So the first thing you want to do in your init hook is call this .super.arguments. If you watched any of my other videos, you probably know why you need to do that, but this is just saying do continue on with any, you know, init function defaults that we might have adopted from our parents. So, you know, do what you would normally do, and then we're gonna do stuff here. So now we want to get that Wistia service. So Wistia is a property I'm going to define on my component, and it's Ember.inject service. Now service takes an optional parameter, which is the name of the service. However, if the key matches that, we actually don't have to write that here, but if you wanted to call it something else, you definitely could. So let Wistia, so now we're in this function, we're creating a local variable Wistia, and that equals ember.get this.wistia. So now we're getting a property on this, which is the component, and a property called Wistia, which is our service. And we also need to get the matcher. Let matcher equal ember.get this matcher, that property that we're going to pass into this component, and then we're just going to call Wistia.addVideo matcher, and that should push that matcher key to the Wistia queue and return a video object for us. So now that we have added the video, we need to add that class that Wistia expects to see. So in our template here, we're going to add a div, and it expects a couple classes. The first is one that's called Wistia_embed. And again, this is all defined in the documentation for Wistia. If you have any questions on that, just go ahead there and look it up. The next one is Wistia async, and then the matcher. Matcher. So this is how it knows which item in our DOM to append to create the HTML5 video. This is what the Wistia API is going to look for. Cool. So that should pretty much be all we need to do to add the video to the page. Now, you look at this add-on, it's all it is a component in a service. You might question, like, all right, how can I actually go ahead and test that this is working? That's actually what the dummy application is for. So if you go to your tests directory, there's another directory called dummy. Let me increase this font size. And in there is an app, just like any other app that you might have. This is an actual Ember app, and this is what is run when you do Ember serve an add-on directory. It's also what's run if you create acceptance tests for your add-on, and it's just a dummy app. You can do anything you want with it. You can install different libraries, etc. So we're going to just add a file, application.handlebars. So this would be like our normal application template that we would have in a regular Ember app. And we're going to call that component that we created, Wistia video. And we're going to pass it a matcher. And again, this is just that alphanumeric code Wistia creates for you. So I'm just going to paste one that I have. And this should essentially be it. The last thing I think I wanted to add was actually wanted to add a default class name to our component here, and I'm going to do that for styling purposes, and I'm just going to call it video wrapper. So components by default are divs, and so this content here is actually wrapped in a div, which is our component, and we've applied a class called video wrapper for it. And again, I'm just going to do that for styling purposes. So let's go ahead and do Ember S. And I have an unexpected token in my index.js file. Looks like I had an extra curly brace there. The errors of just copying and pasting. So it's going to be served on localhost 4200 just like a normal Ember app, because again it is. It's just running through that dummy application. Cool. And it's really hard to see, but our video is actually being rendered. But again, I didn't add any sort of styling here. You notice I didn't add anything to a CSS file. So it's just the default height of whatever a div is. Typically, you don't see CSS in add-ons. There are some use cases for it. If you want just like a plug-and-play component that's styled a particular way, you could certainly do that. I try to avoid it because you kind of want to leave it up to whoever is using the add-on to style things in their app, and you also don't want to override, potential class names, etc. But in our dummy application, we can add styles because, again, that's not going to affect anything. And I'm just going to, again, copy and paste the style I already have. So we're going to style that that embed div to be the full height of our video. So there we go. And I can go ahead and play that. And it's going to play through some content. So we added that pretty easily, right? We created a component, a service that calls the Wistia API. We use that content for hook. That content for hook to add the Wistia API script to our index HTML. And then we created a dummy application to go ahead and test that. So really, really straightforward. At this point, you know, if you're happy, you can push it up to GitHub. You can do an npm publish. If you're not familiar with that, it's really simple. Literally just type npm publish, and it should push it up to npm for you. If you don't have an npm user, it will actually prompt you to create a user and a password right there. So really, really easy to publish it there. Just remember to update your version in your package.json file, and you can do that actually through the command line. You can do npm version patch, and it should increment it by 1 patch version. So now that we essentially have our app running, or our add-on created, let's say we want to actually test this in a more robust environment. So let's actually go back to the super rentals directory. Pull this down. And we'll go to the package JSON here, and we're actually going to add our library that we just created. And what did I call it? Ember Wistia Video. And the version is x.x.x, because we don't really care about what version number it is. We just want it to work. So what we want to do is test our add-on in our live application. The most straightforward way you could think to do this, all right, I'll push my code up, and then I'll publish it to npm, and then I'll add that version here, and then I'll npm install, and I should have it. Really simple, right? One of the great things that you can actually do that will work with live reload is called Npm Linking. So in that directory, let's kill this, and we'll go back to super rentals. We can do, well, we'll have to do an npm install to install our other dependencies. But here we can do, in the Ember Wistia Video, our npm add-ons directory, we can do npm link. Sudo npm link, maybe? Again, running into permissions issues. So now we have linked this add-on, so it's storing it in essentially like a local npm registry. And then in our consuming app, we can do npm link Ember Wistia Video, the name of our add-on, and it will link to that version for us. So now I can do local development on my add-on via my parent app to make sure I'm getting the behavior I want before I go and I publish it or I push it up to GitHub. And the really nice part about that is live reload will notice changes to my add-on and will refresh my parent app. So let's do an npm install here, because I think it's been a while since I've done that. And a Bower install real quick, and we'll do Ember-S. So here's that super rentals directory, or excuse me, repository. Now I want to add a Wistia video. Let's actually copy this exact one because I don't know matchers off the top of my head. We'll go to our index route, and we can just throw our Wistia video right there. Cool. Look, there's our Wistia video. I don't know why it's doing that weird styling. That's really interesting. I have no idea why it's doing that. Oh, Mirage is stubbing its calls. Anyway, that's out of the scope of this, but I just kind of wanted to show you that npm linking is really, really simple. And again, if I go ahead and just make a change in my add-on, let's say I just add another property to this component, and I save it, it's going to refresh my add-on. So I didn't change the add-on, or excuse me, I didn't change the app, I changed the add-on, and Npm Link new to tell live reload to update. So we can kind of really work on this as if it is part of our application. Really, really straightforward. So let's kill this app because I'm not sure why it's doing that. I think that's a Mirage issue, but I could be totally wrong. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. If you care about any sort of rating on Ember Observer, make sure you add things like the author, the repository, where your code is actually living. You can also add, one of the other things I believe it looks for is bugs. So again, this would probably be the name of your repository or a link to your repository /issues if you're using GitHub. This is where people can report bugs. And if you have an example of your app or documentation for your app, you can add a home page. So again, these are things that will help your NPM rating and your Ember Observer rating. Just kind of fill that out and update your README too for instructions on how they can use your Ember app, because that's another thing that you'll get doc points for if there aren't any actual examples for using that. And one last thing too to try or to kind of keep in mind when you go and you run tests, this is the Travis YAML file. So if you're using Travis on GitHub or whatever your Git application is that you use, it will run through certain scenarios within Travis. So the environment, Ember 2.4, 2.8 release beta, it's one of those things to keep in mind when you're creating Ember apps, is that somebody might be on a much older version. So you can add things like Ember 1.13. That was a really, really popular version that was out for quite a while. Might be good to test against that, because you might find that some of the stuff you're doing will actually break in that version. And with that in mind, when you run tests locally, you can actually specify a version. So normally you would do, Ember test. It would go through, in this case, our default boilerplate tests, because we didn't actually write any. But if you wanted to test against a specific version, you can do Ember try. We want to try just one version. In this case, Ember.1.13. And we're going to run Ember test, and we're going to run serve because I actually want to run it in the browser. Ember try one command requires scenario specified in the config. So in order to use Ember try one, a step that I forgot is we actually have to set up an Ember try file in our config directory. So if we go to config Ember try, we actually need to add the scenario that we just wanted to test for. So in this case, it was Ember 1.13. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that. So name Ember 1.13. The Bower dependencies are those versions of Ember. And we now should be able to try that same command. So obviously our tests are going to fail because we didn't write any tests. But just one of those things to really keep in mind if you're shipping, an add-on that you want a lot of people to use, you want to test for all the different versions that they might be using. Make sure you're supporting older versions. You're adding polyfills or fallbacks for newer features that might not have been available on versions like 1.13. And an easy way to do that is to just run tests, specifying what version of Ember you want, and you can kind of work through exactly why those are happening. Makes it really easy to diagnose when things fail versus just waiting for your whole suite to run and then seeing the failures. So just keep that in mind. So hopefully you guys found this somewhat useful. Again, it's a pretty simple example of an add-on. There's lots of different things you can do with add-ons, like adding blueprints. I recommend kind of reading some documentation on that. I felt it was a little out of the scope of this, but If you liked it, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe or leave some comments if you had any questions. Thanks for watching. I'll leave a couple links in the description for the actual add-on, a little more fleshed out version of what we created here, as well as example websites that are actually using it. So thanks for watching.